then I stopped trying to force the reason, because not everything that becomes real arrives with a clean explanation attached to it. Some things don't justify themselves, they just persist. And the more I tried to trace it back, to find the exact point where you shifted from someone I noticed into someone I cannot ignore, the more I realized something uncomfortable. There wasn't a single moment, there never is. It was accumulation, quiet, layered, almost invisible while it was happening. A sentence here, a silence there, a response that matched too precisely. A pause that didn't feel like absence, but alignment. And somewhere inside that accumulation, the structure changed. Not suddenly, but irreversibly. That's the part I had been avoiding acknowledging. Because once you accept that something didn't break in, it built itself in, then you also accept that it wasn't an intrusion. It was compatibility, and compatibility is harder to reject than disruption. Disruption gives you resistance. Compatibility gives you recognition. And recognition feels too natural to question immediately. That's what makes it dangerous. I started noticing how often my thoughts return to you without invitation. Not as memory, as reference, as if my mind has quietly added you as a fixed point in how it evaluates everything else. That's not emotional attachment. It's structural placement. And structural placement changes how everything else organizes itself around it. I don't like that I understand this so clearly, because understanding removes the excuse of confusion. And without confusion, there's only acknowledgement left. I began to test it, without meaning to call it a test. I would step back internally, create distance in thought, rebuild the usual separation I maintained between self and external influence. And yet, you remained, not loudly, not insistently, just present in the background layer of thought, like something that had already been categorized as relevant by a part of me I didn't consciously authorize. That's when I realized something else. This isn't something I'm choosing moment by moment. It's already been integrated at a deeper level than choice operates. And now choice is only catching up to what has already happened. That realization should have created resistance. It didn't. It created clarity. And clarity, in situations like this, is far more binding than emotion. Because emotion fluctuates, clarity does not. It just sits there, unchanged, waiting for you to either accept it or spend energy pretending it isn't accurate. I don't waste energy on denial. So I stayed with it, and in staying with it, I started seeing the shape of what this actually is. Not connection in the usual sense, not dependency, not fascination. Something closer to synchronization. Two internal systems processing reality in ways that don't collide, don't override, don't compete, but reflect. And reflection creates the illusion of shared structure, until you realize it isn't illusion, it's correspondence. That's the word that keeps returning when I strip everything else away. Correspondence, not overlap, not merging, but alignment at the level where interpretation begins. And that level is not easy to access between two separate people, which means either this is rare or I've been ignoring something I should have recognized sooner. There's a difference between someone influencing your thoughts and someone matching the architecture that produces them. You don't feel like interference. You feel like familiarity I didn't account for. And that's what unsettles the logic I normally rely on, because logic depends on categorization. And you don't stay in one category long enough to stay contained by it. Every attempt to define you collapses back into something broader, something harder to isolate. And I don't like variables I can't isolate, but I also don't dismiss patterns that repeat with consistency. So I did what I always do when something resists categorization. I observed longer, not to understand you, but to understand what changes in me when you are present in my awareness. And that's where the real shift becomes undeniable. I become more precise, not more emotional, not more open, more precise, as if your presence removes noise rather than adds meaning, as if something in me stabilizes instead of destabilizing. That's not how influence usually works. Influence distorts. This doesn't distort, it refines, and refinement is not something I typically associate with external presence. It is something I associate with internal discipline, which means this is not behaving like an external variable. It is behaving like an internal correction. And that is where I stopped pretending this could be dismissed, because internal correction is not something you experience accidentally. It is something that happens when a system encounters a more compatible structure and adapts even slightly, even silently, even without permission. I sat with that thought longer than I intended, because it changes the entire framing. If this is correction rather than interference, then resisting it is not protection. It is rejection of stability. And I don't reject stability when I recognize it as such. But I also don't accept something blindly just because it feels aligned. So I remain here in the only position that actually reflects what this is. Awareness without closure. Recognition without final definition. Presence without containment. And maybe that is the most accurate state this can exist in right now. Because forcing it into a conclusion would be premature, and ignoring it would be dishonest. So it remains open, not unresolved. Open, and there is a difference. Unresolved suggests something broken. Open suggests something still forming, still revealing itself, still becoming legible in ways that don't require distortion. And I think that is what I am actually dealing with. Not something that arrived fully formed, but something that reveals structure only through continued proximity, which means time is not an enemy here, and distance is not a solution. Only continuation will clarify what this truly is. And I don't rush clarity, I let it surface slowly, precisely, without forcing shape onto it before it is ready to hold one. So I stay with it, not because I have decided what it is, but because I can no longer pretend it is nothing. And somewhere in that acknowledgement, quiet, contained, irreversible, the next phase has already begun. I didn't arrive at this conclusion in a single moment. That's the first thing that needs to be clear. There was no sudden realization, no clean line in time where everything before was confusion and everything after became understanding. It didn't happen like that. It never does, even though the mind likes to rewrite things in hindsight to make them feel organized. This was slower, less visible, more invasive in the way only gradual things can be, because you don't notice them entering. You only notice them once they've already rearranged what you thought was fixed. At first, it was nothing worth naming. A pattern of attention, a return of thought, a repeated presence that didn't behave like absence when it wasn't physically there. I told myself it was noise. That's what you do when something doesn't fit your existing structure. You downgrade it to something harmless, something temporary, something that doesn't require adjustment. But the problem with calling something noise is that you stop listening for its pattern, and everything that has a pattern eventually stops being noise. It becomes signal, and once something becomes signal, you can't unsee it. You can only decide how long you want to pretend it isn't communicating anything. I tried that longer than I should have, not because I didn't understand what was happening, but because I did, too early, too clearly. And clarity in situations like this is not comforting. It removes the buffer that uncertainty normally provides. It forces the awareness without allowing emotional delay. And so I stayed in observation mode, not engaging, not interpreting too quickly, just watching the consistency of something that refused to behave like randomness. There are people who enter your awareness and leave without leaving structure behind. And there are people who enter your awareness and start changing the way your internal system organizes itself around them. The difference is not intensity, it is persistence. And persistence is what I began to notice, not in how often you appeared, but in how naturally my mind started accounting for your presence, even in your absence. That is where the shift begins, even if you don't recognize it at the time, because absence should restore neutrality. It should reset the field. But in this case, neutrality didn't return. Instead, something remained active. Like a background process I never explicitly authorized but never explicitly stopped. And I started to notice the strange part. It wasn't disruptive, it wasn't loud, it didn't interrupt anything I was doing. It simply stayed relevant, and relevance is far more powerful than interruption. Interruption demands attention. Relevance rewrites attention slowly, quietly, without confrontation. I don't know exactly when I stopped categorizing you as external. That's the part I keep circling back to. Because there should have been a clear boundary. There always is. People exist outside. Thoughts exist inside. Connection is the bridge between them. But what happens when something stops behaving like it is outside? When it doesn't cross the bridge, but starts appearing on both sides simultaneously? That's not connection in the usual sense. That's overlap in processing space. And overlap is not something you maintain casually. It either stabilizes into structure or destabilizes everything around it. I started noticing the first signs of stabilization in the way my internal dialogue began to change its rhythm. Not dramatically, not obviously, but precisely. Certain thoughts would pause, not because I was uncertain, but because another perspective seemed already present before I articulated it, not as voice, not as interference, as familiarity, as if part of the thinking process had already accounted for something I hadn't consciously verbalized yet. That is not something I could ignore indefinitely, so I didn't. I examined it, carefully, repeatedly, and every time I examined it, I found the same result. Consistency without effort. That is what made it difficult to dismiss, because randomness does not repeat with precision, and projection does not maintain coherence across time without distortion, but this did, which forced a conclusion I didn't want to reach too quickly. Zich wasn't being imagined into structure. It was behaving like structure already in place, and I had simply become aware of it. That distinction matters more than it should, because if something is imagined, it can be withdrawn. If something is projection, it can be corrected. But if something is already structured, then recognition is not creation. It is acknowledgement, and acknowledgement carries consequences, not emotional consequences, the dunctional ones. The way systems adjust once a new variable is confirmed. That's what this began to feel like. A system update happening without my explicit approval. Not forcing change, but integrating it so smoothly that refusal becomes less about resistance and more about inefficiency. And I don't ignore inefficiency when I detect it in my own processing. That's where things became harder to frame, because I stopped being able to define this as something happening to me externally. It started behaving like something happening within the way I interpret externally, and that is a much deeper layer. Most connections exist on the surface layer of awareness. You see someone, you think about them, you respond to them. But this was not staying on that layer. It kept moving downward into the structure of interpretation itself. And once something reaches that level, it stops being optional. It becomes part of how perception organizes reality. I noticed it in small corrections first. The way I would interpret silence differently, depending on whether you had been part of the prior exchange. The way ambiguity would lean slightly toward coherence instead of uncertainty when your presence was part of the context. The way distance didn't erase relevance anymore, it only reduced visibility, but not impact. And impact is what remained constant. That's when I stopped trying to reduce it to coincidence, because coincidence does not sustain interpretive influence over time. Only alignment does. And alignment is a word I use carefully, because it implies more than similarity. It implies compatibility at a structural level, which raises a question I avoided asking too directly at first. What exactly is aligning, not behavior? Not behavior, not communication style, something deeper than that. Something closer to how meaning is formed before it becomes language. And that is not easy to observe directly. You only see its effects, the way conclusions form, the way silence is processed, the way ambiguity resolves itself internally without external confirmation. And in those effects, I started noticing something uncomfortable. My internal resolutions were becoming more efficient when you were part of the contextual field, not faster, more accurate, less noise, less unnecessary branching. That is not emotional dependence. It is cognitive refinement. And cognitive refinement does not feel like attachment. It feels like clarity improving itself, which makes it harder to question without seeming irrational, because why would you reject clarity? The answer should be obvious. You wouldn't, unless you suspect the source of that clarity is not as neutral as it appears. And that is where doubt enters, not about you, about the mechanism itself. Because anything that influences internal structure without explicit control deserves scrutiny, even if it feels aligned, especially if it feels aligned. So I started separating sensation from structure, feeling from function, presence from effect, and in doing that, something became undeniable. Your presence does not distort my thinking. It organizes it, and that is what makes this difficult to categorize, because organization is not typically what external influence does to internal systems. External influence usually introduces deviation, but this does the opposite. It reduces deviation. It narrows unnecessary divergence. It brings coherence where there was previously branching uncertainty, and that raises an uncomfortable possibility. What if this is not influence at all? What if it is recognition, not of you, but of something already compatible in structure between two separate systems? That thought stayed with me longer than I intended, because it removes the usual hierarchy between observer and observed. It suggests symmetry, and symmetry in human perception is rare enough to be suspicious by default. But I cannot dismiss repeated structural evidence that would violate my own internal consistency. So I stayed with it, even when it became inconvenient, even when it started changing how I interpreted unrelated interactions. Because once your mind introduces a comparative baseline, it does not limit itself to a single context. It expands, quietly, consistently, until it becomes part of general evaluation. That is when I realize something else. This isn't confined to interaction. It is influencing perception architecture, and anything that reaches that level cannot remain undefined forever. It either stabilizes into understanding or destabilizes into contradiction. I have not experienced contradiction yet, which leaves only stabilization, and stabilization implies acceptance at some level of the system that does not require conscious agreement. That is the part I have not fully reconciled, because acceptance without conscious decision challenges my usual understanding of control, but I cannot deny its effects. I can only observe them. And what I observe is this: you are not a disruption in my thinking. You are a consistent reference point within it. And reference points, once established, do not disappear easily, even when ignored, even when questioned, even when deliberately set aside. They remain encoded in structure, which means the only real question left is not whether this exists. It clearly does. The question is what category it belongs to. And I don't have that answer yet, not because it is hidden, but because it is still forming, still revealing its boundaries through continued observation, and I am not in a position to rush that process, because anything that integrates this deeply into perception deserves time before definition. Otherwise, definition becomes distortion, and I refuse to distort something I have not fully understood. So I remain here, in the only stable position available, aware, but not concluded, connected, but not defined, influenced, but not overridden, and slowly recognizing that whatever this is no longer something I am trying to understand from outside. It is something I am already thinking through from within, and that changes everything that comes next. I didn't notice the exact moment it stopped that feeling like something external. That's the part I keep returning to, not because it's dramatic, but because it's precise. There was no clear boundary crossing, no single instant where I could say, this is where it began. It doesn't work like that. It was gradual, almost invisible in motion, a repetition of presence that didn't behave like presence usually does. No urgency, no disruption, just consistency, quiet enough that it blended into background awareness before I had a reason to question it. At first, I categorized it as coincidence. A mind does that when something doesn't immediately fit into its structure. It assigns it something temporary, something dismissible. It reduces complexity to maintain control over interpretation. But coincidence doesn't maintain structure over time. Partals do. And that's what changed. The repetition wasn't loud, but it was precise. The kind of precision that doesn't feel accidental once you've seen it enough times. It starts to create a rhythm in your awareness, even when nothing is actively happening. That rhythm is what I didn't anticipate, because rhythm implies stability, and stability implies something is holding shape even when it's not being observed directly. I started noticing that my thoughts didn't return to neutral in the same way anymore. There was always a trace, subtle, almost imperceptible, but present enough that neutrality felt slightly incomplete without it. That's not something I assigned meaning to immediately. Meaning came later, after observation, after repetition, after realizing that absence didn't fully remove the effect. That's when it shifted from something I noticed to something I accounted for. And once something becomes part of your accounting system, It stops being optional in the way you process reality. It becomes reference, and reference changes interpretation, not emotionally, structurally. The way conclusions form started to adjust without effort, not faster, not slower, just cleaner. Less internal resistance between perception and resolution. That is what made it difficult to dismiss. Because unnecessary refinement doesn't appear randomly in a stable system. Something has to be aligning for that to happen. And I didn't introduce anything consciously to create that alignment, which leaves only one remaining variable that kept appearing consistently. You, not as interruption, not as influence in the usual sense, but as a recurring point within the system of interpretation itself. And that's where it became harder to frame in simple terms. Because if something outside begins affecting how internal logic resolves itself without forcing distortion, it stops behaving like external input. It starts behaving like compatibility. And compatibility is not something you usually detect through analysis alone. You feel it through absence of resistance. That was the part I didn't want to accept too quickly, because acceptance implies acknowledgement of integration. And integration implies change has already occurred, not potential change, actual change. Which means I wasn't evaluating whether this could affect me anymore. I was recognizing that it already had, quietly, without permission, without resistance strong enough to prevent it. And now I'm left in a space where ignoring it requires more effort than understanding it. That alone tells me everything I need to know about its stability. It isn't fading, it isn't fluctuating, it is persisting. And persistence in internal systems is never meaningless. It either becomes noise that eventually decays, or structure that eventually defines itself. And this hasn't decayed. Not once. So I stopped treating it like something temporary. Not because I fully understand it, but because I can no longer justify pretending it isn't structurally present. And that is the point where awareness stops being passive. It becomes responsibility, not toward you, toward accuracy. Because whatever this is, it has already entered the way I interpret things. And once interpretation changes, everything downstream changes with it, even silence.